It's good to see all of you this morning, and thank you for being here. Thankful that we get together where it's warm and get to spend some time just thinking about our God and reading about our God. If you'd like to take out your Bibles and turn to James 3, we're going to spend the majority of our time there. We're going to read this part of James 3. We're going to bounce over to Ephesians 4, and then we're going to come right back to James 3. And those are all really going to be the majority of our readings this morning. So you may want to put a piece of paper or your marker there. James 3, James is making a point that we all have a superpower. The vast majority of the world has been given this powerful gift by God that demands a lot of responsibility. And it's the power of your voice. That you can say something, and I can hear that something, and you can transmit an idea into my head. That's a big deal. And that's not really anything else the animal kingdom can do. If any other creature can do that, it's our God. He has the ability to transmit an idea with his voice, and he has given, the vast majority of us that ability as well. And if you think about back when Moses was talking to the burning bush, talking to God through the burning bush, it's something that God brings up. He says that he made man's mouth. And he didn't just make the men who can speak, he also made the mute, he says there. That anyone that has the ability to communicate has been given this special gift by God, and there demands a lot of responsibility to control that special gift. So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. We're going to be talking about talking. So let's look at James 3, 1 through 6 together. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they should obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts in great things. See how a great forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire and a world of iniquity. The tongue is set so among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell. Making the point here that your mouth is a powerful device. And if you don't take responsibility to control that powerful device, it's going to send you to hell. And especially there in verse 6. The thought is the tongue is a fire in a world full of iniquity. I think we would say it like this. The tongue is a fire in a world full of gasoline. And anything you do wrong, you might set the whole world on fire with that little bitty flame. And that's what James is bringing up. And let's break down those different analogies together and talk about the power of our voice here. Our voice is like these three things. The first thing he says is our voice is like a bit in a horse's mouth, there in verse 3. And what's the thought behind that? The thought is that you've got this giant horse. And y'all that have been around horses, they're not the size of dogs, are they? No, horses are powerful animals that are taller than you and that they're bigger than you and they weigh a lot more than you do. And if a horse decides it's going in a direction, it doesn't matter if you're in between it or not. He's going to be able to have the power to do what he decides to do. But how has man been able to control a horse? Well, they created bits, and you put that bit in their mouth, and ones that have been trained will go wherever that bit is pulling. And so you can control this powerful force with just something as small as a bit. So is the voice. The voice controls a powerful force. The next example he gives is a rudder on a ship. The voice is like a rudder on a ship. Maybe you've been out to Mobile. I've been able to fish before on a place a lot of us call Dixie Bar, right there where Mobile Bay, feeds out into the Gulf. And if you're out there fishing on the point, you'll see the ships coming into Mobile. Some of these carriers carrying who knows what. It seems like they're miles high when they come into the bay. And if you've seen those ships, you'll know that they're like floating cities. It's incredible when you see one of those things. But then once you see the ship, what do you know to do? You better get your fishing pole and start running. Because eventually that wake is going to make it to the beach. And it's going to knock you out and everything that you didn't catch. These things are powerful forces. But what are they controlled by? A small little rudder. And just like the voice is a powerful force controlled by a small member. Now, as well, 3:5, he says that the voice is like a flame in the forest. Maybe in Alabama, we don't know about the devastation of forest fires like in other places. But didn't we have one recently down in South Alabama? And I understand that a lot of forest fires are started now by lightning strikes, and we have a little bit better understanding of that. But was Smokey the Bear wrong in telling people to take responsibility for their fires? He wasn't wrong about that. You know, when you have a dry bed of forest and there's a fire that's been left unintended, you're responsible to maintain that fire lest it burns down the whole forest, right? So is the voice. It's our responsibility. The point I want to make here is all of these three things are powerful. And all of these three things demand control if we're going to use them responsibly. Not only that, can these three things kill somebody? Can a horse kill you if it's out of control? It can, and people have died that way. Can a ship kill someone if it's out of control? Yes, it can. Obviously, can a forest fire kill someone if it's out of control? It can. And now finally, can your voice kill you or somebody else if it's out of control? You bet it can. And I would maybe even argue the majority of people that die in this world, where they're killed by someone or they kill someone else, all of that began because someone couldn't control their mouth. This is a powerful force, isn't it? Why is this force so powerful? Well, let me propose to you that the reason why our voices are so powerful and can be dangerous is because that power is rooted back in creation itself. You don't have to turn to Genesis 2, but if you'd like, I'm going to read Genesis 2 here in just a moment. In Genesis chapter 1, we meet God for the very first time in the book. And God begins creating the world in 6 days. How does God create the world in 6 days? Well, he uses his voice, right? He says, let there be light, and there's light. He says, let there be a firmament, and there's a firmament. He says, let the dry land appear, and it seems like gravity all of a sudden exists. God creates with his voice, right? Then he decides at the end of chapter 1, let us make man like us in our image. And so he decides to create man. When you get to chapter 2 of Genesis, he gives us the history of man instead of the history of the earth. And after creating man in 2:19, look at what is the first job there in 2:19 that he gives Adam. This is Adam's very first job. Verse 19, out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air, and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called each living creature, that was its name. So Adam gave names to all cattle and birds of the air and to every beast of the field. God, we meet him, and he's a creator with his voice. And then he decides to make man who's going to be like him. And by all means, what is Adam's first job? Is it not to use his voice to create something too? Adam then begins using his voice to name the animals. Adam creates as well with his voice, doesn't he, on a much smaller scale. And then he even goes so far as that he creates woman, and he brings Adam the woman, and he allows Adam to name her woman, which is what he names her. And what I see here is that we have a God that creates things with his voice. He says something and nature obeys. But then he decides to make man and woman a little bit like him. And it's almost like he gives Adam just a little taste of what it's like to be God, which is that Adam has a voice and he can create things too. Now, it's nowhere near to the level that God's voice is, but Adam can do it a little bit. Can you create things with your voice? Adam here created names with his voice. Can you create friendships with your voice? Can you create enemies with your voice? Y'all that are married, did you create that marriage because ultimately it began with your voice? And I'm not talking about you were some good singer or something. You know what I'm talking about. You talked. Can you ruin a marriage with your voice? You know, have men in the world created armies with their voice? Have they started wars with their voice? They've created almost everything on this planet beginning with our voice. Why do we have the power to create with our voice? Well, it's because it was a gift from God. Now, in one hand, that's exciting. On the other hand, that's very dangerous. And I think that's exactly what James is getting at. Our voice is like creation. It is the power to create on a much lower scale, but still the power to create. If we've been given such a responsibility and we want to be like God, there's going to be some things we're going to have to do. And that's why I want to take you to Ephesians 4. James doesn't give a lot of examples, but Paul certainly does in this book. In James chapter 4, he starts off with the thought about how we've been put on the new man. We've been taught by Jesus. And he says, now that we've been taught by Jesus, we're going to talk and behave in a different way. And that starts there in verse 25. Therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he have something to give him who has need. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. And do not grieve the Spirit of God, by which you were sealed by the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. And continue reading with me down to 5 verse 4. 5 verse 4. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. There's a lot right there you can unpack, and I'm going to put these up on the screen so we can look at them at once. But if I decide, okay, you know what, I've been given this power to communicate like God has the power to communicate, and I need to take responsibility and control this powerful force, what am I going to have to do according to Paul? Well, for one, I got to put away lying, right? I can't lie. I can't not tell the truth just for my own selfish purposes. That's not going to work. I have to put that away. And not only that, it's not just about just telling the truth, but I also have to put away corrupt words. Now, certainly, if you're thinking, you know what, there's 5-4 cuss words in the English language, and those are the words I don't say, well, good for you. And I think certainly those words would be in that concept of corrupt words. But are there a lot more corrupt words in the English language that aren't those 5 curse words that we consider to be curse words? Yeah, there is, right? And again, something to consider. I'm going to say just a few corrupt words. No, I'm going to say no corrupt words out of my mouth. Also, I was going to have to put away evil speaking. And I would consider that to be talking about anything excessively evil. And not because we need to discuss something that's evil and say this is bad, but we're just talking about something bad for the sake of talking about something bad. That's evil speaking, certainly. And again, I think that's probably more broad than just that example we gave. You know, I got to put away filthiness. I learned that down in chapter 5. The CSB says obscene talk. Something that's obscene, that's not appropriate to be talking about, is filthy. Well, if I'm going to control this powerful force, Paul says I got to put that away, don't I? And are we done yet? No, we're not even halfway done with the things Paul says. Also in chapter 5, he says to put away foolish talking. Talking like fools because we are fools, right? Just running our mouths for the sake of running our mouths. And usually I know in my situation, when I'm just running my mouth for the sake of running my mouth, who ends up getting hurt? Lots of people end up getting hurt. And usually one of the fools that gets hurt is me, right? Because I'm the one foolish talking. Not just running our mouths, but as well in chapter 5, he says you got to put away coarse jesting. The CSB again says crude language. Is that fitting among the saints? Paul says that is not fitting among the saints. And let me put that in a real world scenario. Now, I understand that there's going to be times in our lives when men get together and get to hang out with other men, and there's going to be women that are going to get to spend time with other women. And I also understand that when you're in settings when there's no one of the opposite sex there, you're going to have different types of conversations that are appropriate because there's no one there of the opposite sex. And I understand it. I think that's a fair thought. However, there have been times when I've just been with guys, and some of my brothers have said the most crude and coarse things I've ever heard in my life. Just because I was with other men, did that make it okay? Does Paul here say, but it's okay to use coarse jesting when you're just with the same sex? He doesn't say that. He completely rids of it. And I've been in situations where the brothers had gotten so crude, and I was in a place, and maybe being a preacher, but I had known that the very thing that they're joking about with their squeaky clean lives and things that they think is just funny, that there were other men in that room that had participated in those very things they're joking about. And you know what happened to me? I felt embarrassed. I was embarrassed that my brothers were making themselves look like fools. You know, why is Paul trying to protect us from? He's trying to protect us from using this powerful ability we've been given to sin. He's trying to protect us from that. And those are things that we have to consider. Now, here's the difference. I'm going to not do these things, but he says back in chapter 4, verse 29, that I'm only going to speak the things that are necessary for edification. What's edification? Edification is the building up of someone. And it's not necessarily always good, but it is the building up. It's constructive words, right? Constructive towards something good. Those are the things that are for necessary edification, and even clarifies again that you may impart grace to the hearers. What is grace? Grace is me or you giving the other person something that they don't deserve. It's a gift, right? It's giving them something that they don't even deserve. A true gift would be building up, edification. And that's how I'm going to speak. Now, that's just what Paul says here. But to continue on, and we're building up to a thought here. You can be ready for it. We're not just talking for the sake of talking. If I decide in my mind after reading this, okay, you know what, Andrew? I'm going to get rid of all these things, and I'm only going to speak what's necessary edification and imparting grace. That's all I'm ever going to say from here on out. You got to think there's a lot to unpack in just those two phrases. Consider these things when we're going to say good things. For one, if I'm going to speak to someone else, I've got to think that there's a difference between what I'm saying and what's being heard, right? There are times in our lives when we're talking to someone else and we are saying one thing, but they don't hear it, right? And now there's a miscommunication. Me and Jason talk about this all the time. We'll get up here and we'll clarify something. We'll say, look, I'm about to say this, but let me clarify. I think this. And then there'll be 3 or 4 people in the foyer that be like, why did you say that? And you would go, well, I clarified. And they'll go, no, you didn't. And I'm like, let's go watch the instant replay. And I rarely get an apology. I get a, what's the issue? I said something, but it wasn't heard. So even though something was said, it actually wasn't communicated. You notice this happens to Paul lots of times too. Paul will say in Acts 17, he'll say the word resurrection. And the moment he says resurrection, does he still have his audience? No, they stopped listening. Paul as well, before the angry Jewish mob at the end of Acts, he says the word Gentiles. And when he says the word Gentiles, what happens? Everybody stops listening. So that's something to consider if I'm going to give what's necessary for edification and part of grace. I don't have to just consider that, by the way. I also got to consider intentions. Sometimes I intend something good, but it sounds evil. Sometimes I intend something evil, but it actually sounds okay. There's a lot to think about, right? And our brain doesn't always match exactly what's coming out of our mouth. I should also consider this. If I just think to myself, I'm just going to be nice. This is easy, Andrew. All I got to do is I'm just going to talk nice from here on out. Just being nice is an oversimplification. And let me tell you what I mean by this. Let's look at some nice things that were said by some good men. Acts 7, verse 51. This is Stephen before a mob that's about to murder him. Stephen says, "You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. You always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute?" Was that just being nice? But are any of us going to argue here at this moment that Stephen was sinning? No, none of us would argue that. Because here you have something that's actually constructive, it's true, but frankly, it's really not nice at all. If that one's not good enough, you can go to Jesus. Matthew 23, woe to the Pharisees. I've always thought verse 15 was particularly brutal. Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel the land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as a son of hell as yourself." Are any of us going to try to argue that Jesus sinned here because he didn't say something nice? What's my point? Just being nice is an oversimplification of what we're talking about. There's going to be times when brutal honesty is demanded. And Jesus took those opportunities. Stephen took those opportunities. Paul took those opportunities. That's an oversimplification of what we're talking about. It's something we have to consider. What about this? Our tone can communicate too. Is there a big difference between me saying, "I'm sorry," and saying, "I'm sorry"? Two different things were just communicated there with the same two words. That's something we have to consider if we're going to impart grace to the hearers. Oh, and look, I have more. Sarcasm. Now get me with this. Sarcasm sometimes can be rude. Sarcasm as well can reveal a truth. And sarcasm, number 3, can even be a sign of endearment to someone you really love. What are you going to do with that? If you want an example of sarcasm, we don't have to look very far. I'm just going to take you to Matthew chapter 3. When the Pharisees and the scribes come to see John the Baptist, in verse 7 of Matthew 3, John the Baptist sees them and he says, "Brood of vipers, who warned you to flee the wrath to come?" What is that? That's sarcasm, right? Or even go back to Stephen in Acts 7. He tells the Sanhedrin there, "Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute?" What is that? That's sarcasm. Sometimes we use sarcasm to hurt somebody, and that's wrong. Sometimes we use sarcasm like John the Baptist and Stephen did to wake somebody up, and that is not wrong. Sometimes we are good buddies with someone and we have earned the right to be sarcastic with them, and we are sarcastic to each other in the most endearing way. Do you see how complicated this is? This is very complicated stuff. Now, again, that's one we've already talked about. What has happened? I only can think of something quick, sarcastic to say at this moment. Here's another one. Sometimes it's rude to speak, and sometimes it is rude to stay quiet. I know sometimes we like to use a golden rule and just say, well, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Is that always true in every scenario? What if you walk up to me and say, "Hey, Andrew, how's your day?" And I go, you're going to take that as rude, aren't you? I communicated really something evil there, or just something weird. There's a lot to consider. Is there any oversimplification we can say about this? This is what I want us to take from all of these things we just pulled out of Ephesians 4. This is a lot to think about. And I think that's why in James 3, James says the tongue is an evil poison, because you're more likely to get it wrong than to get it right. And maybe we would see these things and go, you know what, that's just too hard. I can't consider that. I can't even think about that. Well, if you're in that boat where you just say, you know what, this is too much to think about, then Paul does talk about you in Ephesians 4. Look at Ephesians 4, verse 17. These are the people who aren't even willing to consider. It says, "This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness and greediness." That's someone right there who doesn't care. And they're going to say whatever they feel like saying. But in verse 20, he says, "But you have not so learned Christ." You see, we have to make the decision if we're going to do what is easy or we're going to do what is right. And certainly when it comes to controlling this powerful thing that God has given us, it's going to demand the hard thing. It's going to demand a lot of growth. It's going to demand a lot of thinking and a lot of considering. And that's not going to be easy. But the question is do we want to be like God or not? That's the question. And this isn't something, again, that we're going to figure out overnight. This is something we're going to work on our entire lives. And that's why Paul and James and so many others have tried to give us so much instruction about this. Let's not be past feeling. Let's not be ignorant. Let's try to consider as much as these things as we can when we speak. Let's give you a silver lining of hope. Turn back to James 3, and we're going to read the second half of this chapter. James 3, verse 9, he gives us another analogy of wells or springs. Verse 9, James 3, he says, "With it," our mouths, "we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does springs send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh water." Your average typical person, what does their spring look like? And the spring, of course, here is the heart or the mouth. Your typical average person, their spring looks like this. And we use that analogy in James 3. James says it's like a spring that produces fresh water and bitter water and salt water. And what's his point about this? Nature doesn't even do that. You know, either the spring is bitter or it's fresh. There's no, both. And he uses the example, he's like, what about a fig tree? He's like, if this is true in nature, well, then certainly fig trees bear grapes. And we all know that's not true. Why is nature singular, by the way? Why do springs only do fresh water or salt water? They don't do both. Is it not because God is a single-minded individual or a pure individual and he made a pure substance? You know, that in nature and according to God, things aren't dual-minded, they're singular-minded. They do one thing. And certainly man, however, is not like that. And the real analogy he gives is this is a man who blesses God with one mouth, and with the same mouth he curses man who's made in the likeness of God. Now, you see, again, we have duality. That doesn't exist in real nature. But for some reason, man with this unruly evil, it does exist in him. That's a dirty spring. And you look at God's consideration of this. Are you going to drink out of a spring that's fresh and bitter? You know, you're not. I remember specifically one time being down in Crenshaw County, and there was a well down there that someone had dug. And they're like, hey, we can get some water out of this well. And we went over to the well, and we looked down. And there was like a deer carcass just like floating in the well. Were we all like, all right, it's good water? No, we were like, man, there's a dead deer in there. We were like, this thing's condemned. You know, you either get this thing out and maybe wait a couple of years, maybe throw something down there to clean it up. None of us were going to drink out of that. And you got to think about how God views our mouths. He sees the same thing. He's like, oh, you know, there's supposed to be something good out of this. I hear him pray. I hear him say these wonderful things about me. But in turn, he curses this one who's made in my image. He sees it like there's something dead in the water. And he's not going to want to have anything to do with it in this context. James 1 actually talked about this already. This is a foreshadowing. James 1 says, verse 7, "For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord, for he is a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways." This concept of dualism is all through James, that man is double-minded. They do one thing, they say another. They say one thing and they say the opposite thing the next day, and that's an issue. There's also, of course, in James 1, you'll remember this in verse 26. "If any one of you thinks that he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless." You might have this religious man here, someone who's very spiritually minded, but unless their religion goes in there and tries to grow and change the way they talk, then he's double-minded. He deceives himself. He lies to himself. He's not that singular mindedness that we see in God. If this is man's spring, well, then what does God's spring look like with his mouth? Well, God's spring would look something like this. Because everything he says is true. Everything that he says is for necessary edification. And the perfect James 1 passage to explain the singleness of God, that he's not double-minded, is James 1:17. James says, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, which there is no variation or shadow of turning." What's the thought there? There's no variation in God's spring. God's not going to say one thing and do something different. God doesn't say one thing here and say something different against him later. You got one God and he's got one thought and one mouth. And that gives us a lot of faith in him, that there's no way he's going to do us wrong. He keeps his promises. Verse 18, "Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." Do you remember why we talked about why springs only give one type of water? Why fig trees bear figs and fig trees don't bear grapes? Well, we made the point that the reason why things are single in the nature is because God created the nature. The single-mindedness rubbed off on his creation. How did God create us? Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth. What was God expecting? Or what was God's intention when he made man's mouth? God's intention was for us to look more like this and not like this. That we were going to be the first fruits of his creatures. Now, this is hard to do. It's a lot to control your mouth. And hopefully it's something we get better at every day. But it's not something that, we're just going to figure it out one day and we're never going to have to worry about it ever again. That's not how this world works. But let me give you a drop of hope, and it's really an ocean of hope. In James 1, right after he says that in verse 18, look what he says in verse 21. He says, "Therefore, lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls." Man's word condemns him. But what does God's word do to a man when that man's willing to receive it? God's word, or God's voice, can save man. Isn't that a beautiful thought? When I'm going to spend my whole life struggling just to have pure words, I have instead a pure God with pure words that can save my own soul. Thank you for your close attention, and you can put away your Bibles if you like. As we're still thinking about James 1:21, let me make this point. A lot of us that are Christians now have a similar story, and I think there's probably people in this room that are thinking about the same scenario right now, where a lot of us that are Christians today, we waited to obey the gospel. We purposely waited until we got everything right. And then we decided to obey the gospel. And that was our mindset before we were baptized. And we thought, you know what? I'm still doing these bad things. I still use coarse jesting. I still use corrupt words. Once I get that right, Then I'll receive the implanted word which is able to save my soul. What's the issue with that logic? You will never, ever be able to fix yourself until you receive God. And if you're sitting here and you're waiting, once I get everything right, that's when I'm going to come and receive the implanted word and obey the gospel. Well, then you're already lost because you are going to die waiting on trying to get everything right. We don't make ourselves right. God makes us righteous before him. If there's anyone here that's ready to receive that righteousness, which is that free grace given by God, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing?